to the second event of the series Pedagogical Blueprints from Art School to Public Programme. This project aims to explore the relationship between art and education in Britain since the 60s and is divided into 3 evening events. We started last Tuesday with artist and professor Catherine Elwes, Professor Lisa Tickner and Daddy Tobin discussing the history of the art school from a female perspective and the limits of an institution traditionally shaped and dominated by men. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce 2 guests who have kindly agreed to come and share their extensive experiences of and different approaches to public programs and art schools. Welcome to Victoria Walsh, Head of Curating Contemporary Art Programme at the Royal College of Art. Previously, Victoria was Head of Public Programmes at Tate Britain from 2005 to 2011, during which time she was involved in the creation of the Tate Research Department and secured Tate's first major AHRC-funded project, Tate Encounters, along with the museum's first 3 collaborative doctoral awards. She's currently director of the RCA's major EU MELA-funded project on curatorial and artistic research, in collaboration with 4 European museums, and is principal investigator of a new RCA Tate Research project, Cultural Value and Digital. And welcome to Andrew Brighton. Andrew was formerly Senior Curator Public Events at Tate Modern and has taught at the Royal College of Art, Goldsmiths College and the London Consortium. As well as art criticism, his publications include essays on cultural policy and the rise of management in the sector. He recently published Valuing Modernism, Prejudices, Markets, Traditionalism, Future Value, Criticism, Ethics in Critical Quarterly, of which he is contributing editor. He is currently working on a graphic novel with Catherine Brighton. The project, Pedagogical Blueprints, is organized by Elena Crippa and me, and tonight Elena will mediate the conversation between Victoria and Andrew. We look forward to your question at the end of the discussion. Elena recently joined Tate Britain as Curator Modern and Contemporary British Art. Previously, she was co-pathway leader on the AMRES Arts Exhibition Studies at Central St. Martin's. And before passing on to our guests, I'd like to remind you that the final episode of this project will be held next Tuesday from 7 p.m. and we will host artists Aaron Angel, Celia Hampton and Callie Spooner as a sculptor, painter and performer imagine their or ideal public programs, informed by their different personal experience of art education. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and particularly because you have such a wonderful history of crossing between learning and studying in art school and then going on and writing criticism, organizing public programs, curating and so forth. So I want to ask you if you don't mind telling us about your personal journey that sort of encompasses all the different things, starting with Andrew.
Okay, I'll try. I was a painting student at St. Martin's starting in 1962, and then I went on as a painting student to the Royal College, to the Royal Academy School. Then I went to the Royal College and did an MA by thesis. Because of bureaucratic reasons, I was able to get grants for getting on for 10 years of art school training. I think only John Hoyle and L.S. Lowry went to art schools longer than I did. Having done that, at the end, as I say, I did a MA thesis at Royal College and got into writing. And then I went on and taught at Goldsmiths and various other places. This would be in the 1970s. I should mention that during the time at Goldsmiths, I was a senior research fellow on the Gilbenkian inquiry into the economic situation, which was a research project chaired by Richard Hoggett. So I got to know quite a lot about the political economy of art, and that has continued to be an interest of mine. And then I went on and taught art history, completely, I don't know how I got away with it. Amongst the damaged goods put through my tender pedagogic mercies was Victoria, who I did teach at Oxford Brookes University. but she has forgiven me, and we're still on talking terms. Anyway, eventually I was ended up running an MA in art and architecture in Kent, and then from there I went to the Tate, where I worked at what is now Tate Britain for about 5 years, and then went over to Tate Modern for the final 5 years, by which time my children no longer were economically dependent on me. And in a way I was forced to face the logic of my own position, which was always that I did these things in order to support myself as a writer about art, and I said I will take early retirement and try to exist writing about art, which I've done subsequently. I've published, but I certainly haven't earned the kind of money that would make it possible to do that if I haven't got a civil service pension. So that's roughly it. Now, should I leave it at that, or do you want me to carry on?
As you wish. Do you say?
Well, should I address the content of the thing, or
no, let's begin telling your journey, and then we continue doing that.
Well, he slightly stole my line, which was to say I blame everything on him. Simply because I think that to give a sort of snapshot of my story, it certainly absolutely does start at Oxford, what was Oxford Polytechnic. It's now Oxford Brookes University, but I think it's very important that it was a polytechnic. It had an art school contingent. But it wasn't just a polytechnic, it was the first polytechnic in this country to adopt the American modular system, which most people won't know anything about. But it did mean there wasn't this emphasis on a complete disciplinary specialist knowledge. I studied art history and English, but I did anthropology, I did other modules. It was a different introduction to study. But Andrew did teach me, and the art history department was quite radical. I mean, it had a number of theorists in it. It had at the heart of its curriculum, it had a course called Issues in Art History, which the traditionalists called Tissues in Lies and Art History. But it was a really live moment about what knowledge is in art history. I left Oxford Polytechnic, and I went, by some circuitous route, I went to the MA to study art history at Courtauld, and again hit an institution at a moment of crisis. They'd had traditional art historians, they were trying to revamp themselves. I hit a year when somebody called John House went on a sabbatical, and they brought in 2 feminist art historians, Tamar Garb and Caroline Arscott, who on the first day said, "We're here to render you visually illiterate." So that for the Courtauld was quite something, and that was a moment of huge discussion and debate. Did my MA, then wanted to do a PhD. Everybody said you have to go back to Oxford University, you can't go back to where you started. Didn't go very well, ended up in a kind of legal battle with them. But that was about classical knowledge systems. My PhD was going to be about the critical reception of Whistler, 19th century artists in England. Art history said it was English literature, the English one said it was history of art.
This is Oxford University?
Yeah, so Francis Haskell. So I went back to Oxford College, which was where knowledge was exciting. It wasn't pigeonholed, it wasn't classical structure. But while I was doing my PhD, a friend of mine said, "Have you heard about this new MA at the RCA, Curating Contemporary Art? You should apply." Because the one thing Oxford Poly did teach was contemporary, which many places didn't. Went to, applied, was offered a place, didn't have any funding, and the Arts Council refused and were discouraging the offer of my place because I was an art historian, and they wanted the curating programme to be for practitioners. So already that distinction has been made. The head of the programme, Teresa Bledo, secured funding for me from another private source, Paul Hanlon, and I did a course and everything changed. But again, I realised thinking about it, everywhere I went, I hit a moment of crisis about who owns knowledge in relation to art. And the curating programme at Royal College was in the art school, but to be in that art school as an MA, the theory, the validation of it, had to be in conjunction with Middlesex Polytechnic. So we'd have to go out to Middlesex Polytechnic for theory, because there was none of that in the art school. Did that, finished my PhD after that, and ended up freelancing, but essentially at Tate on and off for about 10 years, and was part of the opening of Tate Modern, and And it's very strange, as of September, to go back to the Royal College of Art 20 years later to the course that I started out on. But in the middle of that, I suppose what I did see working at Tate was the whole almost swapping of places between the art school and the museum. Because in public programmes, and I inherited a model and a set of arguments from Andrew, being my mentor through all this, I suppose, was really the idea of what could be done in public programmes in terms of knowledge in the museum in an unregulated space that wasn't happening in the art school. But equally it's a time when museums, when the process of demonstrating their research value to the national culture and becoming the equivalent of universities to access funding status. So the whole kind of location of knowledge and what is knowledge and the debates about who can provide it for people sort of seem to be on the cusp of these places. So it's strange when I think about it. I haven't really looked back on it.
I guess it was quite different when you were in the art school.
Well, yes, I think it's quite useful to think, trying to think historically, the virtue of history that it kind of critique the present. I think if you say, where did this tradition of an event like today and the public events in museums start, and how do they relate to art school? I think they probably hardly if I was thinking of a source, we were talking about the source and I was suggesting the ICA, but actually I'm rethinking, I think probably the Slade, when Coldstream became professor, he started, I think, a series of public lectures and programme of talks there, in addition to lectures given by the academics. And when the ICA started, and that would be, what, 46? And when the ICA started in 48, they had a programme of public lectures, which I think was very important in as much as the independent group was actually formed primarily around the idea of doing a public programme of lectures. And I would want to argue this is a moment when, because you remember the ICA was the first institution dedicated to showing international contemporary modern art in this country, that the public programme that went with it was articulating a new relationship between contemporary art and the public sphere. And so the idea that somehow there should be a discourse which was public, which should take, to which you have people like us, somebody talking and then an audience reacting back and arguing discussion, became a model which we've run with ever since, and which we are in a sense in that tradition. So I'd say it's a mixture of the art school Slade tradition, and the Slade goes back to the idea that art is a serious intellectual activity, as distinct from art as a trade or art as a form of training people for education, which the Slade was different. And I would like to posit for you an idea that in the 1840s, 50s, the art schools were created to improve the arts of manufacture. But they were flooded with women, and women wanted to do fine art. And so fine art grew in the art schools. And in the Ministry of Education, an embittered man sits, who has been there since the 1840s, who has, over the years, contrived to try to kill off art schools so they turn back into as boring and confined as institutions as they were in the 1840s. And I think he's just about succeeded. But that's maybe the topic we will return to. So anyway, so what I'd say is that one was inheriting a tradition which of talk around art, serious talk about art, which in a way, now if somebody comes to me and gives me a footnote, I'd say, look at the Coldstream report, and there you have the requirement that there is art history in art schools.
That's 1960.
Yes. In 1960 you have art history taught, but also this thing called general studies, which took 50% of the discursive part of what went on in art schools. And the point about that was that it was undefined. So when I first taught in art schools, I taught art history for a time, well I taught, art history, for the best word up here, in Farnham, and I taught at what was then the West Surrey College of Art and Design, and I taught with a guy who had a first from Oxford in archaeology, another one who had the distinction of being expelled from Oxford, who was a classicist, and a woman who was a Canadian who was a Jungian psychoanalyst. And so there was those kind of things going on. It was artists as intellectual that Colesbury report, positive as a model. And that is something quite different from artists as academic or artists as theoretician. And that, for me, was always the model for the audience that I was trying to program for at the Tate. It was always the core audience were artists who were intellectuals, and which meant, in a sense, that they are interested in they were interested in the world. They were interested in why are we here, how do we give meaning, can meaning be given, etc., etc. Fundamental questions. What they were not interested in was how do we construct an academically legitimated discourse in which we could teach art or art theory, etc., etc. So, in a way, that model, that Colesbury model, I am a residual, a hangover from that model, which I will defend with and argue for with some passion.
What is interesting to me, having interviewed a few people about that moment, particularly in the 60s, where about the beginning of the General Studies Department, there seems to be quite a split between what it was by then the Painting and Sculpture School or Fine Art Department, in some of the art schools, and the General Studies Department. And I have two very different stories. One is we don't want the General Studies Department, we just want to make stuff. And the other story is in a way the opposite. For example, we had Lisa Tickner here last week, and she was saying as a female student in the fine art, in the paintings department, we would just be told you're never going to make it. You've already failed because you're female, basically. While a few years later, she was teaching a program or a course on feminism within the General Studies Department of the same school, and it sort of gave the impression that General Studies allowed different type of attitudes and allowed women artists or men artists didn't quite align with the traditional way of thinking to start discussions and debates about what it was to be making art and what it meant.
I think it's immensely variable from art school to art school. So she went to Hornsey, I was at St. Martin's. My sense of St. Martin's was it was a dictatorship of the talented. If you were talented, then you threw. If you didn't, if you were mediocre, you were not particularly, you weren't particularly picked up. And some of the people who were talented were women, as I remember. And but I mean, I wouldn't have recognised any sexism going on in relationship to women because I was probably deeply embedded in that ideology anyway, and B, it wasn't my history. But I meant my wife was there. And I don't think she has any account of sexism. She was talented, she was congratulated, given time. But the point, I mean, I suppose the major thing I don't want to deny that was a problem. I mean, I heard somebody, I think Colesbury, you should say, well, girls, we don't bother to look at the portfolio, we just look at the photograph. It was pretty appalling, so we don't want to shy away from that in some institutions. But I think there was, at a good art school, a commitment to talent. And the virtue of the art schools then was that you didn't have to have A levels, O levels, or any of that stuff. And St. Martin's was stuffed with very bright kids from the East End. Many of them had no A levels or A levels, particularly in dress design. They're so fucking bright. It was wonderful. But it was me being middle class, educated, relatively conventional. At least I had 5 O levels and all that sort of thing. It was a revelation to have this guy next to you who couldn't spell his own name hardly, who could draw the art of you. And because there was this tension. This is the substantial point. The point that I think was good about art schools at that time, that there were different discourses in tension. So you had an artisanal thing, the idea of skill, You have emerging intellectualism. You have the whole thing of art history beginning to attend to contemporary and modern art in a way they haven't done before. And then you have these very eccentric, but often very bright people who were psychologists, archaeologists, or whatever. And so they were malformed, in tension, incoherent, immensely stimulating places. So, and you got odd people turning up. I remember William Burroughs coming up and talking to us at Tate Modern. And you know, it was precisely because it was messy, precisely because it was people were having to make it up as they went along. This was its virtue, and I think that space, by us being absorbed into universities, has been gradually closed down. And so, but you can look at me and say, there's an old fart going on, nostalgic. But I can think, I would make this point to you, and this is hard fact. The number of staff per student is now a quarter of what it was in my time, and that's been optimistic. The amount of space a student has to work in is much, much, much less. So the amount of capital, the amount of money given to an art student and their development in these terms is much, much less. That is hard economic fact, and that is part of what has gone on. And that time where, for example, my wife describes as her golden moment was being spending half a day in a dark room with a technician being shown individually how to develop a photograph by a technician who really knew his onions, who went on to inform people like Craigie Horsfield and John Gotter and Andre Klemowski, who's now head of Royal College Illustration Department. But you have incredibly able people teaching you how to make things, and they had the time to do it. So my worry now is, do the people who teach know how to make things in any special way? And if they do they have the time to do it? But this is maybe I'll try not to go back onto my pessimistic cry.
I'm sure we will go back to this subject again and again tonight. I just want to sort of follow up on what you were describing as this very messy environment where you had all these different figures, the artisans, the art historians, the people who very various disciplines, energetic intellectuals. Where does your sort of idea of the artist as an intellectual is a sort of combination of all these different elements, or where does it sit within this sort of very diverse environment?
Well, you couldn't take a topic and say that's out of court because it's not it's not art discussion. But there was, but then to go to Goldsmiths, if you went to Goldsmiths, because it was part of the university department, so I'm a bit contradicting myself, there was a huge library. But I remember the ex-head of the Royal College saying the Royal College Library is a very good art school library. And the point, of course, whereas Goldsmiths, there was philosophy, theory, etc. in the library, and that was part of the discussion in the studios. At the Royal College, at the time that I'm talking about, this is 20 years ago, they were kind of still pretty dull. And so it's a very various history. One should be careful to look at institution by institution. I think I'm rambling, and I ought to try and address the central topic of maybe public programme in
let's go to 1995 when you started your programme on the Tate. There seems to be a clear link between your experience as an artist and a teacher in art school and this idea of the artist teacher, the artist intellectual that sort of you took into the development of your public programme.
I should say one thing. Having run an MA course previously, known and been up against the idea of the MA course and closed if you didn't find students, when I went to the Tate, I was very well aware of the economies of institutions. One thing I did at the Tate was to increase the price for attending events. And partly it was because I thought we should match the ICA's prices because they had no level of subsidy like we did. And so we shouldn't be underpricing them. And secondly, it was the idea that if you had a budget, you could develop your department. So eventually one was in a position to appoint somebody to do the ticketing, and if they said to you, oh, well, we can't afford that, you'd say, well, okay, we'll cut the programme, but that will mean that our income will go down to a figure which at present actually covers this appointment. So it was me who insisted that we paid our way, or went a long way to paying our way. So the income, I think, when I arrived, was about 12,000 a year, and I think it was about 120,000 by the time I went to Tate Modern. And that was the idea that if you're bringing in money, it gives you liberty. And the way you brought in money was ticketing, but also doing deals with institutions, getting people like when artists, I particularly work with Victoria Miro, and so artists coming in there from her, and you got the overseas artists for little or nothing. You just a dinner. I used to take Victoria Miro and a distinguished artist to a curry house which had been recommended in Alan Clark's diary, and I remember her husband telling me that she'd had indigestion for 3 weeks after I came. Anyway, but it was what the fun for me was, to a certain extent, was making deals with institutions, getting people in, and some of the greatest events were done by making deals. I remember I did something with the Art and Christian Inquiry, which for the first half was largely North American art historians who were Christians talking about these wonderful artists they had talked to, who were art critics and art historians, which was pretty well unadulterated kitsch. And then in the second half was a man called Father Menendez from Cologne, who'd done things with Joseph Beuys, etc. He'd done this thing with John Reed Byers, and Tom McEverly, John Thompson, and the future president of Arts Academy, Rowan Williams, not Chan Williams, Rowan Williams. And it was one of the bloody magical events when we showed this pretty basic tape of this white mass that Byers had done, and people talked about it, and the art people were very bright, and the theologians were bright, and it just took off. And that, I didn't have the money for that. I got that from doing a deal, having a morning of crap, and then this. And so it was, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It was like a, it was like a barrow boy. I enjoyed it.
It was really fascinating. It was such a different landscape. You see, 20 years ago, we started having adult public programs at the Tate, and you have the ICA that pretty much was there. You just started going to the Tate as a student, was it?
No, the reason why I started going there long before that. The reason's not worth just the bus stop outside.
But you were not there, you remember some of those discussions?
Yeah, no, the James Lee Byers event was a kind of epiphany. I mean, anyone who was there, it was one of those events which I think public programs can do, which was, were you there? It was a bit like, were you there when Liz died? Were you there when this happened? It was amazing. But I think the thing about what Andrew set in motion, I mean, what Andrew's describing, which is a kind of discourse we can't use now in the professionalisation of practice in our careers, is the level of wheeler dealing that goes on, and still should go on, but doesn't in public programmes. Because in a way, the best thing was you were, and if you're still good at it, you operate under the radar. I mean, I think Nick's right with his approach to you was probably, you were lucky it was that kind of, as long as you don't get us into trouble, get it to do what you need to do what you want to do. I mean, public programmes in Andrew's time were seen as real critical value. It was everything that you couldn't do in the exhibitions, and that was a kind of, you didn't acknowledge that, it was just something you worked with. So there was huge excitement about it because it was this kind of intellectually promiscuous programme which you couldn't find anywhere else, and it was kind of promiscuous. Everywhere else was very straight-laced, and you could do things which you couldn't find anywhere else, and people did pay for it.
So was it about creating an intellectual community of artists, you know?
You couldn't predict who your audience are. I mean, there were certain lessons to learn, an awful lot of things that went wrong, things that went right. But I remember one of the big events was that we had Melvin Bragg and Valmaniucek, a whole lot of media stars for the event. Virtually nobody turned up. Next week it was Paul McCarthy. The place was packed out. And you're right, you're in a city of 8 million people. There are a hell of a lot of people who are seriously interested in art. I mean, it's a doddle, really, to run public programs in London, because there are so many bloody interesting people. But if you can't, I always thought that actually, if you got the right publicity, you could have a 2-day conference on bicycle clips, if you had the right mailing list. I mean, and
there's a big difference between that moment and 95, because contemporary, you know, 6 years into Tate having a completely new programme and addressing, and there was a momentum building up towards making the case for modern contemporary art towards the building Tate Modern. There weren't competition spaces. Whitechapel wasn't really programming, South London, I mean, there weren't other spaces. There was either Tate or ICA.
yeah.
So you didn't have competition, which is, by the time that I took over in 2005, there wasn't the same competition. You didn't exist, you know, I mean, there weren't. You knew your competition. But even in 2005, people were much more well behaved. You knew what the remit of each institution was. You know, the Serpentine was mid-career, you know, South London Gallery was most probably early career. You know, there was a kind of rationale. And we all used to get together and go, what are we programming? It wasn't a competitive market. You weren't going, but I want that group, and I want that group. And that changed dramatically in the 2000s and the 2000s. Everybody was looking for the same audiences, chasing the same artists. You couldn't tell, you know, an artist could turn up at any space. So that really changed things. The market changed things, galleries, programmes, because the whole relationship to income generation changed. And kudos, you needed the rise of programming, which is also the rise of the need to produce audiences. I mean, that whole Arts Council funding emphasis about producing audiences and audience engagement, and the government, I mean, New Labour coming in 2007, programming was the way to visualise and materialise audiences. That was the produced audiences. And then the next game was, how do you build a sustainable repeater? So then you have membership, you know, it became a whole, whereas, you know, ticketing in your day, slightly when I started, there wasn't a ticket box office. You know, you had somebody in the office taking down, you know, whereas then it all became data-based and a mass operation. So a very different, 10 years was a huge culture difference.
What was ever for any of you the idea of public program and the kind of program that you were putting up in relation to the nature of the institution that you were representing somehow? Did you ever have, like, in mind as a starting point, I was representing this
collection?
Yes, or like...
I would put it like this. I would say I was trying to do what Tate should do, and to a certain extent, I think one reason why I was, I mean, and I would not, because I wasn't trying to do what Nick wanted done, but to do things that he would be glad that when he went abroad, people would say, "Wonderful content," etc., etc. I mean, in a way, it was because we both had the same audience, which.
But how would you define that thing that Tate was not doing? Maybe it's not
Taking risks.
Being generous. I mean, in a way, if you're a public program, you can invite artists, and quite a lot of artists spoke at the Tate and then were bought or exhibited at Tate a couple of years later. And so you I mean, it's a major commitment. It's a major commitment to buy work. In a way, if you get them over and have to talk, that's not a major commitment. So you can be more promiscuous. And in a sense, I would say, I would have said it would be nice to think that you were actually helping to inform curators, but on the whole, curators never turned up.
I mean, that was the big thing. That's never. I don't think that's changed, and that's maybe also because they're busy. But curators never came to programs. They never seemed to ever want to come, or they didn't come. But I think there was one thing that Andrew was always very clear about, and I didn't just inherit it. I absolutely agreed with it, which was we keep running public programs, but it was adult programs. I mean, there weren't other programs, but but we weren't there to service the exhibition programme. And curators, more or less in sort of my time, it's like there's this thing being called in and, you know, we're doing Matisse, you know, what are you doing? And I think that the great thing, we're not helping our colleagues tell the secret to this, but the great thing, of course, is if you've got your own budget and you hold on to your own budget, you have independence. And the more you can defend your budget, generate your own income, your own partnerships, the more leverage you have to say, then, you know, that's a great idea. And the second thing that curators never seemed to understand was what they thought would be a good event very, very rarely was. Usually they wanted to bring in people who they thought were experts, but who had no form of communication and whose knowledge was based in a catalogue.
Yeah, and they wanted to replicate,
just
amplify the
I
catalogue.
mean, it was just, you know, whereas, you know, it's still underestimated the skills of public programming, and they are skills, because you are choreographing, you are setting in motion in terms of debate, things you want people to respond to, but you're also responsible. You know, you're not just responsible for what happens up there, you're responsible for the audience, for marketing, for ensuring all sorts of details that make something happen as a live event, like live broadcasting. And that's very different to the set of skills of putting works of art on a wall or working with an artist in space. It's not the same as working with an artist on stage. You know, all sorts of different things happen. So that thing about not servicing the institution, whether it was the collection or the exhibition, I think was important because people wanted something different to happen.
I'm going to give a slight example of that. When I first started, I wasn't allowed to invite a Turner Prize artist to come and speak because the curator in charge thought it'd be too much restraint. Unfortunately, early on, Craigie Horsfield, but he said that he wanted to address the nation. And so he said he wanted to speak. So if he was going to speak, then everybody else would have to be on. And they all said yes. And then there was a tradition whereby if they Turner Prize artists wanted to give a talk, they did. And so that was done. But at the beginning, partly it's about curators wanting to possess the artist. And partly they are, if they're art historians, they intend to be in awe of artists and magical people. But if you've been to art school and you peed in saying your rival, you're rather less inclined to go into magic. And so you say you want to get up there and do say something. And to a certain extent, I always thought you made it as good for them as possible until the moment they went on the stage. And then it was up to them. If they wanted to make themselves look an arsehole, that was entirely up to them. But up to that point, you looked after them, and particularly the hour beforehand, they're usually a bit mad, and you take all sorts of shit. But once they're on the platform, and it's them and the audience, and it's up to them. And if they're up for it, they're up to it. And if they're not, if they want to keep quiet, fine. And there was a terrific one. I mean, I think Sarah Lucas, the first time Sarah Lucas was, it was magic. I mean, certainly, once she did it more than once, it was less magic. But the first time, she was so bright. Thomas DeMann, I remember being particularly bright. Lovely, somebody got up asking his political question. He said, don't ask me that. You might well ask, I could answer, but my answer would be no better than a bus conductor's. I mean, as an artist, he was very interesting about his politics, which clearly is very important in his work, but it was very interesting about, when he spoke, what he could say as an artist.
But I think there also, and that wasn't more interesting, but I think the shift from curators having an investment and that kind of discussion, the relationship with the artist, I think that also, by the 2000s had moved into public programmes being seen as a form of marketing. So it wasn't just about supporting different knowledge, the exhibitions, it was seen as marketing. I'm not saying by the marketing department, but by curators who were worried that the audiences weren't going to come to their show. So you had a sort of even worse pressure. But I think what I also saw through the 2000s, I had really 80% autonomy, so I'm only talking about small instances, but I wonder if they're not more prevalent now, which is that public programmes have also started to be seen as kind of band-aid, a kind of quick fix to a problem, like a form of risk management, because if something went wrong or something needed a counter-narrative, and the whole thing around post-colonial discourse was, it would be parked inside public programmes to be sorted out through discussion, and I think that kind of ghettoisation of topics or types of discourses, but I mean for a sort of quick fix one that backfired. I mean, I've written and published about this, so I'm not saying anything that's not out there, but there was a problem when John Latham's God is Great was about to be shown. This is 2005. It is 2005, it's summer 2005. And the week it was about to open, the July 7th bombings happened. And because of the nature of this work, which is a sheet of glass that goes through the Talmud, the Quran and the Bible, there was concern that this would be misunderstood because the Quran it's not a representation of it, it is the word. So there were endless discussions held there. And in the end, the work was not put on display. And the press release gave health and safety reasons, where it's apparent that there were more issues at stake. And John Latham spoke out, he spoke to the press and he spoke to everybody. And then, you get the call, can you organise a public debate? And so it's like, well, so what autonomy does one have with this debate?
Which mug did you get to chair it?
Of course it you.
Yep.
Oh God. Sorry, I really forgot that. And I genuinely, we approached it, we had lots of meetings to discuss, how to really do it. And John refused to take part, he sat in the front row. I don't think it was a bad event, but I'm not sure that was the best use of public programmes. I don't think it changed, I don't think it gave anybody, it put a spotlight on the issues of ethics, responsibility, curator, all sorts of things, and about the nature of John's work, but it didn't address actually the problem, which was a whole new relationship with audiences and a concern, not just because of that specific instance, it was an increasing concern about the public museum being seen as accountable and representative of everybody, but not really knowing how to do this. Particularly the difference between Andrew's timeline is by the time I get to the Millbank site in 2005, it's Tate Britain. And Tate Britain was in crisis about audiences because everyone was at Tate Modern. And why would you come to Pimlico where there are no cafes, no bars, no reason? So, I had to think about public programmes in a very different model to assuming that even though there was an art school that just moved next door, there were less artists in the building than ever before immediately. So you have to have different strategies. I had to come up with different strategies with the budget and different tactics to create a free programme, and created later Tate Britain, which was, that was under public programmes. But by 2005, the institution, under cultural policy, which had become much more sophisticated, perhaps, focused, was audience development. You had targets, categories and financial categories, demographics, and all these that you had to demonstrate how you were addressing them. And that was, that coincided. So you had numbers of targets to be hopeful, but that also coincided with Tate having to begin to think about what the state of the research culture was, because the opportunity was coming up in 2006 to apply for what was called, under the Arts and Humanities Research Council, affectionately called analogue status, which meant like a university, standard independent research organisation. So it was thinking about publics here, it was thinking about cultural diversity there, it was thinking about young people and its local audiences, and then specialists and all of that was coming under public programmes, and the learning department. So it was that whole thing of being able to say it was about the artist, that was the core. There was no core, I mean, the language of the core was rejected by learning.
Well, it wasn't really about art, it was about art, and that was what it was about. And it wasn't about education. The pressures you did get, I was under, was that it was part of the education department, eventually called movie. And
I've just learned the difference.
I mean, fuck off. I mean, it's about art. And there are lots of ways in, and sure, You know, I've taught evening classes, I've taught in schools, briefly, very badly, art, and you do teach, etc., etc. But essentially, an institution like that is about art, and trying to mould it on a notion of education, or indeed the sort of imperialism that says of certain audiences that are obliged to come. I mean, it is bureaucratic bollocks, and it's actually ultimately authoritative. Right. It is.
They can't put this up on the website. Okay, bleep.
Well, I mean, the website can say all sorts of things. But I mean, no, it is part of the managerial state. I mean, there's a kind of way that you disrupt those sort of the managerial state in 5 spaces, and then they will come in and close them down and make them much more difficult to say and do things.
We are more interested to explore further the relationship and tension between the curatorial department and the learning and public program department. I want to start, I was really fascinated when you said where there were issues that the curatorial department wouldn't address, like post-colonial, so we had to do it in the public program.
Well, if I said wouldn't, that would be unfair. They didn't know how. I mean, that was the end. That was the anxious. What do we do? Can you help? Was more or less the model of. There was what was created by cultural policy was Black History Month, and again, I'm not saying anything that's not known, but there was a room in Tate Britain, right-hand side, called Goodison Room in London. Which behind post-war security and staff called the Black Gallery, because it was only ever known as this was the space where you saw, and it was Paul Gilroy who curated a show called Picturing Blackness, which had become notorious. And so, learning didn't recognise these categories. I mean, learning, you see, I think the difference is not necessarily so true in Andrew's domain, only Andrew can comment, but in 2005, people who were coming to work in the education, it was called the Interpretation and Education Department, and then became learning, there were artists. I mean, that was, artist educators were a massive workforce on temporary freelance contracts. But the majority of people were not art historians. They were coming from community education or, graphic design, or, but they weren't art historians. There wasn't a sense of this fixed, authorised knowledge base. And that wasn't what audiences were interested in. That wasn't what they were. And if you were trying to develop audiences, that wasn't what you were using. It was other things like architecture, design, fashion, music. It was culture. And that's just about different, not just about different entry points, but actually that's where artists were, a much more mixed. It wasn't just fine art or visual arts. And performance was on the rise. Later Tate Britain became, a vehicle that all the departments in learning commissioned and programmed next to, and again, it's more thematics and brought in, as many artists as it did academics as much as journalists or others. But we did have performances, but it created, we would then be taught, but you're not performance curators. You're not taking performance seriously. And it would be like, well, hang on, these, artists, I won't name, but they're happy to do it. Oh, well, it's not an appropriate way to handle. We should. I was like, but they like having audiences. Well, no, and that whole struggle between who designates the space and interprets the type of activity was an extraordinary, particularly in relation to performance.
I had a bit of that sort of struggle with film.
I was just about to say it's got an origin in the film today.
Because they were not going to put a 35mm projector. They had one planned for the auditorium at Tate Modern, and then they would kind of cut the price, the cost of things, and I wrote memos to various people, and so the fact that they got one was largely because the pressure was on to have one. And then we had a film programme, and it took a long time to develop, but once it developed, it became a major thing. And once it's this thing that if you have people coming in, paying, and filling the bloody place up, gives you an awful lot of reach to hold this stuff off.
I mean, just just as a kind of, I like telling this anecdote to people just about what the relationship between logistics and making things happen is. Courtesy, historically, the slide collection, visiting lecturers using slides, particularly Tate Modern had hundreds. Who made slides, they were sitting there. The slide collection then became part of public programmes because that's where it was. By the time I got there in 2005, I was responsible for the whole of AV for Tate, which was 3 members of staff with a handwritten diary. Simply because the slide collection had turned into the technical, had turned into the film projector guide. And of course, the reason why I could do later at Tate Britain was I made the case to upgrade all the technical, upgraded all the equipment, the cameras, the monitors, the film projectors, and managed to then use all that technical equipment for later at Tate Britain, because I owned it, in terms of department. And I think owning the means to do what you need to make happen is crucial to being able to do something, particularly in large institutions, having the tools of what people need. And of course, we knew how to run this equipment and use it. And we, the thing about, and this was true of your team, Sylvia and Half, is we understood the spaces. We knew the art very well. We were actually in these spaces. We didn't just hang shows and walk away. We were in these spaces all the time with people. We knew how people, interacted with both the building and the works. And it gave you a better sense of how to work with programs. And the main thing from I think the different time was the dynamics of how people wanted to interact with public programs was not in the auditorium, was not this broadcast model that we're on even tonight. People wanted to be in the event, and the whole rise of event culture and the experience economy as it was at that point has been described.
As an old programme organiser, given what Vicky's just said, I think we should ask people more on this question.
So anything you're saying is really interesting.
I have lots of more questions, but yeah, you're
right.
We're interrupted. It's a programme, isn't it? Does it resonate, any of it? Does it mean anything? I don't know what the interest in programming is now, other than it's on the runs. Why are you all sitting here? What do you want to know?
I was wondering, I'm sure you know about the query between Platform London and Tate about the BP sponsorship. Well, my question basically is, do you think that, what's your position about this, and do you think should a public institution reveal something about their sponsorship and how actually the funding influence the public program? That's a big question.
Can I say number one? There is a very primitive idea, which is that if you take money from X, they make you do what you want to do. One lesson I learned very early on and watched the people in the development department do it, is you take their money, but you do what you want to do. And you must not let them tell you what you have to do. In my experience at Tate, they were good at that. And I think if you looked at Nick Schroeder's history, he has slept with lots of devils, but he's always used their money to do what he wanted to do. So you negotiate, there's space, but essentially you do what you want to do. You get lost. Once you let those pluggers tell you what they want, and then you are lost. And that's what happened at the Victoria Museum, for example. And it's very difficult. It's a tough one because usually people, certainly in my area, came in, they didn't really know what they wanted. Well, what they wanted, you'd say, well, I'd love to bring in a distinguished American aesthetician or Tilly the Douve or something like that. And they'd say, well, who's that? And anyway, they get the idea. You see, what they would never tell you is they wanted an event where their friends would come and they would all have drinks and they would have this event and they would all think it was wonderful. And it would do them good. So when you then had a deeply serious philosopher talking at them for an hour and a half in very difficult terms, it wasn't what they wanted, so they got very disappointed. So you took the money and you used it. But when you now get to the big pieces, I mean, the problem with that is the idea that if the people who are giving you money are bastards, therefore what you produce is bastard art or bastard events. You know, the history of art, I mean, the basic history of art, particularly architecture, is entirely a history of the taste of rich bastards. So there's, you know, if you're going to make that criteria, you've got to, you know, it doesn't work unless you're going to throw out the whole of art in order to be politically correct, because most of these people, I mean, most of the great patrons of the art were by nature guardian rulers, let's face it. So but I do think there's a kind of way, however, that these people are getting certain moral kudos from giving money to the Tate. And I think to a certain extent, the reverse can happen. If they are particularly disgusting people, then the Tate start to pick up some of their dirt. So I would be very pragmatic about that. If, you know, I'd say, I know that, for example, they don't take money from tobacco people, which is, I'm, you know, an ex-smoker, sorry about this, but it is, I'm only vaporising because I'm a pretty vaporous person. So they're puritanical, that sort of thing. So I think it's negotiation, but the core thing is you take their money to do what you want to do. And I repeat, in my experience, I want to take it.
I don't think I really got much to add to that. I would, and I don't think it's changed, that there was, I never experienced, and I don't think I knew of any other instances where anyone ever felt subject to forms of sponsorship. But that was because Tate was very politically sophisticated, and the sponsorship and fundraising department was very sophisticated, and it was a clear guidance from the top, which was to keep that distance of delivery and programming. There were small moments, but usually it could be batted back very quickly. I mean, somebody at the top doesn't need naming, I don't think right at the top used to say there's no money dirtier than governments, you know, and we had a grant and aid, which was, yeah. But I think the funding model of Tate, and this is all it takes, we were taking it, it's a bit specific, so, but you know, the income model, by the time I was there, was a third grant and aid, i.e. government money, a third income generation, and a third sponsorship. And if you keep that balance, that dynamic, you're not accountable, you're not pulled by anybody. Yes, and there's a real case for that. Yes. You know, it's not like in America where you really are beholden, and you hear a lot of the problems of that. That dynamic is really important. That can be true at any level, you know, of institution. You keep them because they want to be there, because there's credibility that comes from this source, but there's kudos and another network comes from that source, and it's a sort of moving thing. But I'd also say, you know, there is a sort of self-censorship that, you know, kind of, you know, I never forget Chris Smith, a conversation in some programme that we did, talking about cultural diversity policy, and did he really expect it to have the negative impact it had in terms of actually perpetuating conditions of cultural difference and actually creating inadvertently a more racist model than one's operating. And I remember him saying, you know, we write the policy, but we never expect people to really take it up literally. You know, it's a direction, and I think that's the danger, is that people become in fear of their funding sources and actually implement something that's not even there. I mean, I think policy is there to be engaged with, not just delivered, and I think that's where some of the Arts Council, you know, clients, as they were, you know, became beholden or fearful of losing, and therefore compliant and perpetuating a relationship that wasn't being artful, a kind of self-managing. Thousands of questions?
Yeah, I have one which is actually a rather big question, so you can just answer some thoughts. But I'm really interested in the idea of education as research, and how, for instance, when you were at Tate, your program was, I think about the Tate Encounters, for instance, like rethinking the idea of public program as opening up as well the notion of museums and researching the idea of museums, and how did that evolve now where you are within the university, and what education means now for you. And for Andrew, the same question can be applied. For, again, when you were in the educational department, where you also taught a lot. So what was the difference in the very meaning of education in both situations? It's massive.
First of all, I would say certainly wasn't doing education as research. The shift from education, which was a shift that happened in the higher education sector as well, that move from talking about education as a fixed body of knowledge to be communicated to learning, as in creating conditions of learning. That, I think, there's lots about the relationship of public programming to what was knowledge and what was about creating learning experiences. But the research culture that emerged was at one level about formalising what was already happening. It was about that moment of when there was an opportunity to become like a university, i.e. have access to very substantial funding. You know, a lot of those activities with higher education were already happening in terms of conferences, seminars and other things. I think because I had come from an sort of academic background, I was very interested in taking that agenda up, and there wasn't a research department, these were the early days. But the things that I was interested in right at the beginning, in the run-up to that, was identifying the kind of research that the museum could do that nowhere else could, but wasn't interested in replicating the university. And I started talking to artists and people in the art school, John Thompson and yourself, you know, what are the things that we can ask that aren't being asked but should be asked by a National Art Museum? And it was the whole thing about what's happening to the academicisation of knowledge in the art school. So created two conferences, well three in fact, that were quite timely looking back, which was one was called Creative Scholar, which was asking what is the nature of this academic, this rise in research or the rise of discourse, what does that mean to practice? And we had a very good conference, and you raised the point, no PhD has won the Turner Prize. There was no evidence that having a PhD increases your value in the art market, and there was no evidence, that how you get. So the whole. I mean, do you want to say?
Well, yeah, it was just that. I mean, I was still teaching art schools when the research economies emerged in higher education, and watched it. You know, the requirement that you have art students were required to produce written thesis as part of their submission, etc., etc. And I think it was. I mean, you know, I was pragmatic, saying, well, we should take the money and run. But I think actually it sort of is a sort of a sludge that's taken over. And so I noticed that nobody who's been shortlisted, as far as I know, maybe one or two, but as far as I know, nobody who has been shortlisted for the Turner Prize got a PhD. From one of the multiple PhD programs that go on in art schools.
I think Elizabeth Price has a PhD.
Oh,
Elizabeth Price has
was also 2 years ago.
right. Okay.
But I think.
Well,
but it's.
yeah.
But I think. I mean, that conference, it was a 2-day conference with the University of Brighton, and people driving who were interested in that as well. It was coming from the collaboration with the University of the Arts, was the relationship between art and design, and everybody wanted to have the debate were about design. And there were very few artists who wanted to, or who could talk to it. You know, and then the next conference that kind of engaged still in this kind of what's happening to practice and discourse in this academicisation moment was a conference about research as exhibition. You know, what kind of form, what does that mean? What is this exhibition, this proliferation of exhibitions as research? Because it felt, and it still feels, just joined the HLC, so I shouldn't say it, but it still feels quite a sloppy moment that these kind of terms are, you know, sort of very open and fluid. But out of those conversations, we did create this project, Art School Educated, which Elena came through and will still deliver. And I think the logic of some of that was that, might have been Aaron, but I don't know, but the idea that Tate could do a project, this was before everyone was reflecting on their own institutional histories of art schools, was that it needed to be captured before they were all dismantled and absorbed and the archives lost. And wasn't that something that Tate could do because it was impartial? And I think that's where, this is so Tate, this conversation, but I think that's where the reason, it's like, there's something here that can be done in a kind of research and history that is not the same as replicating somewhere else.
I think it's good for you to keep saying this is a very Tate conversation, because if you're running a gallery in the regions or a smaller gallery in London, you don't have the life is a lot more difficult to do. It's a different, we'll put it as a different form than working at Tate.
Can I follow up on this one? Just putting myself on the spot. I run a public art institution, publicly funded art institution in the region, is in North Wales. And I do actually agree that's why I'm here, actually, to hear about actually what I didn't experience myself directly, but there has been a kind of shift from public program, from being attached to an exhibition program, to having some sort of independence and value in it. And in the place where I work, actually, there are 3 areas of the program, which is learning, formerly known as education, and then exhibition, and then engagement. And the budget is split between the 3. Somehow it's mirroring also the third of the funding, so self-generated and government and the sponsorship, the trusted foundation, blah blah blah. Although they're not separated for each of the fund, but it's kind of it is a strange mirroring there. And it's true what you were saying, Angela, in my experience, that yes, an art institution, it is about arts, but ultimately I think what an art institution is a place to discuss life, contemporary life, through contemporary art. So I do think there is some sort of a need for the engagement, learning and exhibition to sort of talk to each other and not going for separate directions. And the way I found it is to plan well in advance, so to plan at least 3-4 years in advance. And at the same time, when you're planning your exhibition and you're initiating your launch and blah, 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 you do put together on the table ideas for the engagement and ideas for the learning, which has a much shorter sort of a notice in terms of timeline, operational timeline. But if you plan them in advance, you can actually plan them in advance. You can plan together with the 3 curators and the 3 teams.
Do you get good audiences?
We do have, it's in Llandudno, it's in North Wales, it's Boston, and it's a very tiny town, it's not even 20,000 people, but we do have an audience of 80,000 per year, which is quite amazing actually for the place it is. And I would say that probably half of it comes through repeated visits for the engagement and the learning as well. And that's another value of the public program, I think, is precisely that it provides opportunities for people to come back. To have another type of experience, maybe around the same subject or theme or whatever the season is about. So I'm a big argument against, okay, yes, it is about art, but not only, I would say. But that's from my management point of view as well.
You said art and life, you can't discuss art without involving ethics, etc. So, yeah. No, because I used to live in Oxford for a time, and the assumption was, when they said, put the Museum of Modern Art at Oxford, you get a student, which of course you didn't get Oxford students there at all. And in a way, you need to build your local audience. And I think, actually, your local artists are perhaps where you begin.
Absolutely. And I do think the public program is key to build that local audience. Otherwise you become an alien that shows international art and you have it doesn't have any link whatsoever with the community to which you're part of. Obviously, you know, if you're in London, you have a critical mass of, you know, kind of
But I mean, there's a
I don't know, 100,000 students, and if you are somewhere else, you don't have the critical mass ready made, so to speak.
But it's also, and one seeing it, the slowing down, or the ironic deceleration of exhibitions and collection and display changes even in London, mainly because of the recession, and the cutbacks, that programming is in the ascendant because that is the vitality, otherwise the audiences will disengage
you compensate
somewhere else.
somehow.
Yeah, you know, so it's, and that's quite good too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about public programs. I think it is, you know, a bit like you described art as intellectually promiscuous. It's flexible, you know, it's quite light-footed, and I think it should be light-footed as well. I mean, long-term planning is one thing, but in a way you've also got to be reactive to the topicality, I think, sometimes of where things are. There was a...
Well, there's lots of things, you know, there just seems to be a really, really broad discussion, and maybe sort of pull through strings and pull it together. And the first point that I come up with is that some of the problems that we're going through now seem to have been identified in 1968 when the students at Hornsey took over the college to try and get art education reformed, post the Colston report. And the other thing that I'd like to draw in here is that you mentioned the academicisation of art school education and the parting of the waves between what was called cultural studies or contemporary studies to what is now basically a kind of justification program. It's a way of justifying your practice. Students now are trained to write texts that justify their practice, and those that can justify their practice more accurately than those who can't justify their practice end up getting the first. And that comes down to the public programs or the curatorial programs, which are in justifying their budget. They have to get numbers through the door to justify their budget, and that's where I'm interested in the public programming, because that seems to be the only place left where you mentioned the fleet of foot, where if you have control of your own budget, you can actually still move under the radar, as it were. You're not being controlled or dictated by numbers, by justifying your position, by justifying your budget, or within the art schools, justifying your teaching, justifying your practice, and justifying your outcomes. I hand that over.
Culture by justification. I mean, justification is. I mean, it's sort of like
Just to lay on top of that. During the Second World War, Winston Churchill was criticised for not slashing the arts budget and taking the money from the arts budget to put to the war effort. And Winston Churchill's reply was, what are we fighting for? And it seems to me that now has been lost. That's now, you know, the managers are now in charge of the budgets and they want justification. We're going to give you this amount of money, but we want to see results. Whereas previously, we trust what you do, you know what you're doing, we don't know what this is all about, here's the money, go and do it because you know what you're doing. Now, it's, here's the money, I want to see results. That's the justification I'm talking about.
yeah. Evidence-based policy, Yeah. etc. You know, no, I think you're right. You've pretty much said it. I mean, and that it has been a historical shift, and it is a problem particular to public funding. Because I mean, you could say, you know, you've got to, if you're going to use sport money out of general taxation, then you have to it has to be examined, etc., 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 kind of well and politically justified. The only thing is that actually, I think most people are happy with the idea that the arts do what the arts do. And it's the politicians and the bureaucrats who want justification in order, in a sense, to assert their own power. And there's more goodwill towards the arts than the politicians are willing to admit. So I don't think it's a real political pressure to justify the arts in the way they're being required to be justified by the new Labour. As far as I can see, the Tories have learned the lesson of keeping quiet about. I mean, don't seem to be quite so willing to declare what the art should be doing anymore. They seem to have been less.
Well, I was just about to say, I should tread slightly carefully as I articulate this, but the arts went through what higher education is going through now 25 years ago in the 80s. You know, they were the easy target under Thatcherism, post Thatcher under John Major. They were scrutinised, they were audited, they were asked to make the case. And that, you know, was actually written up and is still being written up as actually quite a welcome moment in retrospect, because it brought on a project of modernisation. And it saw, because the arts had to make the case, it had to, you know, turn inside itself, look at itself, it became more sophisticated and accountable. And, you know, Dick's Rosa, you know, is on record as saying, you know, it was one of the best things that did happen to the cultural sector, because it created these new mixed funding models and self-sufficiency and autonomy. And the way we're talking about owning the budgets and having independence, it was something that also allowed institutions, if they could become partially self-sufficient, not wholly, you would have the autonomy. And that's where culture got. And I, you know, I've got to be very careful, I've just landed back in the academy. What I see going on in higher education and the quality of the debates is the same starting point as where culture was. Well, let me, I'm in it now, so it's, you know, and I think and it's not a criticism, but what I see is the paucity, the quality of some of the debate that is only one of retrenchment and resistance and complaint, rather than a better discussion about what is the universities for, what is knowledge for, what is the place of the university in the 21st century, how does it relate to other types of space or the art school, and I think that we need that better discussion. I mean, I was absolutely struck. There was a conference we did about the art school, part of the Arts for Educated project in Chelsea. College of Art students wanted a platform at the end and came in, and that was great, and I did a thing. And then it turned into a kind of a, you know, culture of complaint discussion, which was fine. And then Nigel Llewellyn and I had a research, said to them, you know, but why aren't you pitching for your curriculum to be redesigned? And they said, well, we don't have one. And I said, well, no, you do have a curriculum. That's your contract. That's your, you know, what do you think you're learning? What are you doing? And there was just this complete like, oh well, we don't know. You know, there's got to be a better system of understanding what is being asked for on both sides and what is expected. And of course, I think why it's come to such a crude crunch point is you have international students paying enormous sums and wanting to know what they're getting for that money. And so you know, that level of accountability, however crude it's being pursued maybe at government level, it equally needs a better discussion back. Because if you own the agenda from the sector about what is this for, what is the art school for, what is the higher education for, then you start owning the terms of the debate. But you know, and the whole strikes that have been happening last year and will continue, I'm sure. There are discussions about holding back exam results coming up across the different unions. You know what? You know, I heard it even across meetings at UAL with students recently. You know, they didn't even know what the strike was about. Well, if students don't know why the tutors are striking, you know, what's the level of connection in that experience? I mean, there's something not quite happening.
You know,